Two police officers publicly humiliated an elderly woman right at a diner just because she forgot to bring her wallet. But with a brief phone call, everything changed. You won't believe their shocked expressions when they discovered who she was speaking to. This story not only evokes deep emotions but also brings a profound lesson about respect and fairness in life. Where are you watching this story from? Share in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more compelling and meaningful stories like this one. Let's get started. In a small corner of town, Sunny Diner used to be the perfect spot for cozy family meals. The soft neon lights reflected on the windows, creating a familiar and peaceful atmosphere. This was the place where Sandra Brown, a 72-year-old widow, had come every week for the past 15 years. For Sandra, Sunny Diner was not just a restaurant, it was an essential part of her life. Since her husband passed away, this diner had become the place where she found joy. Sandra would often order her favorite dish, a roast with a cup of black coffee, and sit at her usual corner, enjoying the meal while observing life unfold around her. The waitstaff always greeted her with friendly smiles, and a few regular customers would occasionally nod hello as they passed by her table. For her, it was a small, peaceful, and comfortable world. But lately, Sunny Diner wasn't the same. Since Jake Turner, an ambitious man, took over the management position, everything had changed. Jake wanted to modernize the diner and make it a livelier place to attract a younger crowd. Sandra noticed the gradual yet significant changes. The traditional menu was replaced with modern dishes, the classic songs that once evoked nostalgic memories were replaced by loud electronic music, and noisy groups of young people now occupied the tables, laughing and chatting without paying attention to anyone else. Sandra felt out of place. She had once thought of Sunny Diner as a place for everyone, but now it no longer welcomed her the way it used to. Yet, she continued to visit out of habit, unable to easily part with the memories tied to the place. One day, Sandra walked into Sunny Diner as usual. She sat at her familiar table and ordered her roast and black coffee, like always. In her mind, she felt a slight unease, thinking about the family dinner she was planning. But after finishing her meal and looking for her wallet to pay, a bigger worry suddenly arose. She checked her bag several times, then emptied everything onto the table, but her wallet was nowhere to be found. A moment of panic flashed across her face as she remembered that she had left it at home. Sandra looked around, hoping to get some help from someone familiar. She thought she could explain the situation and run home to get the money. She had always felt reassured that the staff, who had known her for years, would understand and offer assistance. But today, unfortunately for Sandra, Jake Turner, the new manager, was present in the diner. Jake Turner, with his cold eyes and stern face, had never been fond of Sandra's presence. To him, she was a customer who didn't bring in much business. Week after week, she only ordered a few simple dishes and occupied a table for hours, while he wanted to replace her with groups of young people who spent money without hesitation. Sandra tried to stay calm as she saw Jake walking toward her, but deep down, she feared that something unpleasant would happen. She just wanted to quickly explain the situation and promised to return with the money. But Jake, with his clear look of disdain, showed no sign of being willing to listen. What was about to unfold today was not going to be a minor mishap. It would turn into a series of events that Sandra never could have imagined. As the pride of an elderly woman was tested by the disrespect of those who didn't understand the value of kindness, Sandra sat silently at her table, her gaze drifting over her handbag. In her mind, she replayed the images of this morning when she was checking the list for the family dinner. She clearly remembered placing her wallet on the kitchen counter to check the cash, but in her rush, she had forgotten it. She sighed, feeling a bit uneasy. Throughout her 72 years, Sandra had always taken pride in being organized and careful. Yet today, this small mistake had happened at the worst possible time. She rummaged through her handbag once more, hoping for some miracle that would help her find the wallet, but the bag remained empty. Sandra felt a bit dizzy, her hands trembling slightly as she carefully placed everything back into the bag. She knew what she had to do. She would explain to the waitstaff, who had known her for 15 years. Surely they would understand and give her time to return for the wallet. With that belief, Sandra stood up, her handbag in hand, and walked toward the counter. But just as she was about to speak, the sound of footsteps echoing on the floor made her pause. Jake Turner, the new manager, was walking quickly toward her with a stern expression. Jake's tall frame and sharp features exuded an imposing presence, and Sandra immediately felt like she was stepping into an unwanted situation. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Brown?" Jake asked, his voice cold and impatient. Sandra tried to smile to keep the atmosphere light. "I'm so sorry, but I just realized I left my wallet at home," she said, her voice calm but slightly shaky. "I live just nearby. If you give me 15 minutes, I'll be back to pay in full. I can leave my handbag as a guarantee." Jake shoved his phone into his pocket, glaring at Sandra with a sneer. He approached her table, standing tall, arms crossed, as if preparing to deal with a criminal. "Mrs. Brown, I think you should understand your position," Jake said loudly, his cold voice echoing through the diner. "This isn't the first time I've seen situations like this. This forgotten wallet story sounds all too familiar." Sandra felt a flush of heat spread across her face. She looked around and realized that all eyes in the diner were now on her. Some young customers nearby started whispering to each other, giggling as if watching a comedy scene. She could feel the humiliation settling over her, but she tried to stay calm. "Jake," she said, her voice attempting to sound firm but trembling slightly, "I've been coming here for 15 years. I've never had any issues with paying. This is just a small mistake. I left my wallet at home, but I live nearby. If you give me 15 minutes, I'll come back and pay in full." Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smirked, his face full of contempt. 15 minutes, and I'm supposed to believe you? You know, a lot of people have said the same thing, and they never came back. Maybe you don't think I'm smart enough to realize that." Sandra gasped. Jake's accusation not only surprised her but also deeply offended her. Throughout her life, she had prided herself on her honesty and dignity. The thought that someone would consider her a liar truly broke her heart. "I'm not like that," Sandra said, her voice rising with emotion. "If you don't believe me, I'll leave my purse as collateral. It's something important to me. I wouldn't leave it if I wasn't planning to come back." But Jake didn't flinch. Sandra's offer seemed to only make him more dismissive. He looked at her purse as if it were worthless. "A purse? Sorry, Mrs. Brown, but we're not a bank, and we don't need to hold collateral for anyone. If you can't pay, I have no choice but to call the police." Jake spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Some customers chuckled lightly, while others looked at Sandra with either curiosity or pity. Sandra could feel her face burn with embarrassment. Every word from Jake felt like a knife to her pride. "You don't have to shout like that," Sandra tried to stay composed. "I just want to settle this peacefully. I'm not trying to skip out on the bill, and I think you understand that." But Jake wasn't interested in listening. He shrugged and said sarcastically, "I don't know who you think you are, but we can't just let people eat without paying and hope they come back. This is a business, Mrs. Brown, not a free cafeteria for those who can't afford to pay." Jake's words not only belittled Sandra but also revealed his true motive. He didn't want her there, nor any older customers. In Jake's eyes, people like her took up space without generating much profit. He wanted to turn Sunny Diner into a place for young people, those willing to spend on expensive food and trendy drinks. Sandra looked Jake straight in the eye, her gaze flashing with disappointment and anger. "You think people like me don't deserve to be served here? I'd been a regular long before you came. This was a place where everyone, regardless of age, was welcome." Jake smirked, showing no remorse. "Yes, that was before. But now, it's different. We need new customers, not people who occupy a table for hours with a cheap meal." Sandra felt a wave of indignation rise within her. She couldn't believe that after all her years of patronage, she was now being treated like an inconvenience. But she realized that no matter what she said, Jake wasn't going to change his mind. He had made up his mind to push her out, and she couldn't stop him. Now, as Sandra was still trying to figure out how to handle the situation, Jake turned his back and walked toward the counter, continuing his phone call. He spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, deliberately making Sandra feel more humiliated. "Yes, I need 2 cops here right away. We have a customer refusing to pay and not cooperating. Sandra stood there clutching her purse tightly. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her. But this time, she didn't feel small or afraid. She knew that if Jake and the others thought she would bow down and give up, they were mistaken. In her heart, Sandra told herself that she wouldn't let this situation end the way Jake wanted. Even if she was humiliated in front of everyone, she would protect her dignity until the end. And though Jake hadn't realized it, every action he took today would lead to consequences he never expected. The sound of police sirens broke the tension in Sunny Diner, shattering the already oppressive atmosphere. Sandra sat quietly at her table, her emotions in turmoil. She had hoped Jake would change his attitude or at least give her some time to resolve the issue. But now, she knew this had gone beyond anything she could have imagined. The door of the diner opened, and two young officers, Officer Ryan Davis and Officer Mike Blake, stepped in with confidence, even arrogance. They were dressed in neat uniforms, their cold eyes scanning the room as if searching for a dangerous criminal. Jake quickly approached them, acting as if he had summoned two heroes to rescue him. "Thanks for coming so quickly," Jake said, his voice feigning anger. He pointed toward Sandra, who was sitting silently at her table. "That's her. I asked her to pay the bill, but she refused and claimed she had forgotten her wallet. This isn't the first time I've dealt with situations like this." Ryan and Mike nodded, listening seriously. They glanced at Sandra from a distance, their eyes filled with judgment. Even before approaching her, they had already formed the opinion that she was a liar, a deadbeat trying to scam her way out of paying. "So she refuses to pay?" Ryan asked, his tone authoritative, not even turning to look at Sandra. Jake nodded confidently, his face smug. The two officers walked toward Sandra, each step echoing heavily on the floor, intentionally creating a sense of pressure. Sandra looked up, her gaze calm but cautious. She had lived long enough to understand that this wasn't just an awkward situation. It was a public humiliation orchestrated by Jake, now joined by two people on his side. "Do you have anything you'd like to explain?" Mike asked, standing straight with his hands on his hips. His voice was cold, his eyes as though he were looking at a criminal. Sandra took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm and clear. "I explained to the manager that I left my wallet at home. I live nearby, and I offered to come back and pay in 15 minutes. I even offered to leave my purse as collateral, but he refused." Ryan raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Forgot your wallet? That sounds familiar. Are you sure you remember what day it is, or did you forget where you are?" Mike sneered, stepping closer, his eyes full of sarcasm. "Mrs. Brown, do you think your story is convincing, or is this the excuse you often use to dodge responsibility?" Sandra felt her face burn with embarrassment, but she didn't let her emotions overwhelm her. "I don't think the truth needs to be convincing," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've always been an honest customer, and I've never done anything to make anyone doubt me. This is just a small mistake." Ryan shrugged, his eyes full of contempt. "A small mistake? Is that what you call skipping out on your bill? Do you think we'll just believe you?" Mike leaned in closer, lowering his face to Sandra's level. "Do you need us to help you remember your home address, or have you forgotten the way back?" His words came with a mocking smile, making Sandra feel like she was being cornered. Outside, customers started noticing the scene. Some young people pulled out their phones and began to record, treating it like entertainment, a funny story to post on social media. Some whispered among themselves, while a few just watched silently. Sandra could feel clearly that no one was standing by her. Even the wait staff, whom she had once considered friends, avoided her gaze, lowering their heads as though afraid to be involved. Sandra felt a wave of shame rise within her, but she wouldn't let herself fall. She looked the two officers straight in the eye, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I don't need anyone to help me remember anything," she said slowly and clearly. "I just need to be treated with the respect that anyone deserves, which no one here is willing to do." Ryan and Mike looked at each other, smirking, as if she had just said something pointless. In their eyes, Sandra was just an old, weak woman who couldn't defend herself. But they didn't know that everything was about to change. The phone call Sandra made earlier wasn't meaningless. What would happen next would surprise them all and make them regret their actions. Sandra sat silently at her table, feeling humiliation and anger rising within her. Though mocked and treated unfairly, she still tried to remain calm. Her self-respect, something she had built over decades, would not allow her to break under the disdainful gazes of the manager and the two young officers standing before her. She opened her purse, her eyes searching for something. The two officers, Ryan Davis and Mike Blake, stood nearby, observing. Ryan raised an eyebrow when he saw her take out her phone. He took a step closer, his expression stern. "What are you doing, Mrs. Brown?" he asked, his tone full of suspicion. Sandra didn't respond right away. She slowly dialed a number, as if there were no rush. "I'm just making a call." "It's my ride, isn't it?" she said in a calm but sharp voice. Ryan glanced at Mike, and they both looked displeased. "You don't need to call anyone," Mike interjected, trying to sound tough. "This is just a minor incident. We can handle it here and be done with it." Sandra didn't answer, simply holding the phone to her ear. After a few rings, she began speaking softly but with clear intent. "Hi, honey. I need a little help. I'm at Sunny Diner right now. There are a few people here who don't think I deserve any respect." Mike and Ryan paused. They hadn't expected her to make a call in this situation. Her tone didn't sound like someone pleading for help. Instead, it was as if she knew exactly what she was doing. Mike took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You need to end this call now," he said, his voice threatening. "We don't have time for meaningless complaints." Sandra continued the conversation, ignoring Mike's threat. "Okay, I'll wait." "Thanks, honey." After hanging up, she gently placed the phone back on the table. She raised her head, her calm gaze meeting the two officers. "I've finished the call. Now, what do you want to do?" Her voice was challenging, as though inviting them to test how she would respond. Ryan felt uncomfortable. He wasn't sure why, but Sandra's demeanor made him uneasy. It wasn't the usual worry you'd see from someone who was accused. She wasn't begging, she wasn't pleading. She was simply facing the situation head-on, and that unsettled him. "You think a phone call is going to solve this?" Mike said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He sneered, then turned to Ryan. "Maybe she just called her lawyer." "I bet no one's going to show up in time." Sandra didn't respond. Instead, she stared at Mike, her eyes cold and unwavering. Mike began to get frustrated. He hated the way she looked at him, as if she were the one controlling the situation, not him. "That's enough," Ryan said, trying to take back control. He stepped closer to Sandra and grabbed her arm. "You've refused to cooperate, and we don't have any other choice." Sandra didn't resist, but she didn't show any signs of fear either. "Do you think this is right?" she asked, her tone steady. "Handcuffing an elderly woman over a minor incident, is this how you want to be remembered?" Ryan didn't answer, but his eyes flickered with a hint of confusion. However, Mike moved forward, pulling the handcuffs from his belt. "We don't need to justify ourselves to you," he said. "This is protocol. If you don't comply, we'll have to act." Mike quickly cuffed Sandra, the cold metal clicking sharply in the diner. Sandra felt the chill from the handcuffs tightening around her wrists. She furrowed her brow, not from pain but from the humiliation she was enduring. Ryan and Mike stood on either side of her, leading Sandra toward the door. All she could hear were whispers from the tables around her, the soft music still playing from the speakers, and the occasional giggle of a few young people recording the entire incident on their phones. Jake stood at the counter, arms crossed, a triumphant smile on his face. He felt satisfied. Sandra was finally being removed from his diner, and he no longer had to worry about her coming back. But Sandra didn't lower her head. Her back was straight, her gaze fixed ahead. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone made it clear this was not the end. What was happening now would not be the last word, and those who thought they had won would soon realize their mistake. Ryan and Mike, though they didn't express it, also felt uneasy. Sandra's call kept them wondering. Who had she called? Why didn't she show any signs of fear or desperation? Deep down, they felt a vague sense of worry begin to creep in, and they didn't know it would soon become reality. As Ryan and Mike led her outside, a voice suddenly broke the silence. Stop. This isn't right at all. Everyone in the diner turned toward the voice. It was Emily Green, a longtime waitress at Sunny Diner. Emily, in her early 30s, wore a faded uniform. Her face was flushed with nervousness, but her eyes were filled with determination. She had worked at the diner for over 10 years and knew every regular customer, including Sandra. She couldn't stay silent when she saw an elderly woman being treated this way, especially when she knew for a fact that Sandra hadn't done anything wrong. Ryan furrowed his brows and looked at Emily with displeasure. Who are you? Do you have something to say? Emily didn't let the implied threat in the officer's tone intimidate her. She stepped forward, standing between Sandra and them like a small but firm wall. I'm Emily Green, and I've worked here long enough to know what's going on. You can't treat Mrs. Sandra like this. She's not the person you think she is. Jake, who had been standing with his arms crossed at the counter, raised an eyebrow. Emily, get back to your work. This isn't your business. Emily turned to face Jake, her eyes filled with disappointment and defiance. No, Jake, this is my business. I've worked here for more than a decade. I know exactly what kind of person Mrs. Sandra is. She's been coming here every week for years, always pays in full, and has never caused any trouble. Just because today she forgot her wallet doesn't mean she deserves to be treated like a criminal. Jake sneered and walked toward Emily. You don't know what you're talking about, Emily. I called the police for a good reason. She didn't pay, and I don't tolerate that kind of behavior in my diner. Emily faced Jake without backing down. You're making things worse, Jake. This isn't how we treat customers, especially people like Mrs. Sandra, who supported this diner longer than anyone else. Ryan and Mike exchanged glances, a moment of hesitation passing between them. They weren't used to being challenged by a waitress, but Emily's assertiveness made them pause for a moment. Mike raised an eyebrow and turned to Jake. What's she talking about? Is Mrs. Brown a regular? Jake, clearly losing patience, shrugged and ignored the question. Don't listen to her. She's just getting emotional because she knows her. But I know better. People like Mrs. Sandra often take advantage of their connections to avoid responsibility. Emily's face flushed with anger, but she maintained her calm tone. No one's taking advantage here, Jake. Mrs. Sandra didn't need to deceive anyone. She clearly said she had forgotten her wallet and was willing to come back and pay immediately. We can't turn a minor incident into something bigger than it is. Jake scoffed, turning his back on Emily. You think your words will change anything? This isn't personal, this is business, Emily, and I'm not letting anyone, whether it's her or you, damage this diner's reputation. Emily stood her ground, her fists clenched, but she didn't let Jake intimidate her. You may think this is business, but I think this is injustice. If you won't listen to me, ask the other staff. We all know what kind of person Mrs. Sandra is. Jake spun around, his face now colder. Emily, if you don't get back to work right now, I'll have to reconsider your position here. A heavy silence fell over the diner. Emily looked at Jake, her eyes filled with disappointment. She knew he could make good on his threat. But when she looked at Sandra, an elderly woman being humiliated in front of the entire diner, she knew she couldn't stay silent. If you want to fire me, go ahead, Jake, Emily said firmly. But I can't stay silent when a good person like Mrs. Sandra is treated this way. The entire diner fell into silence. Ryan and Mike stood motionless for a moment, glancing at each other as if questioning whether they were doing the right thing. Emily's resolve made them uncomfortable, though they wouldn't admit it. Jake, however, wasn't about to back down. You want to defend her? Fine. But it doesn't change the fact that she didn't pay. The police are here, and they'll handle it, Jake said coldly. Emily turned to Sandra, her eyes filled with sympathy. Mrs. Sandra, I'm so sorry for everything that's happening. But I promise I will do everything I can to make sure the truth comes out. Sandra smiled gently, her voice still warm. "Thank you, dear Emily. Don't worry about me. I've lived long enough to know that the truth always prevails." Jake crossed his arms and shrugged as if he no longer cared. "All right, officers, please take her away. I don't have time for any more arguing." Ryan and Mike, though slightly hesitant, continued to escort Sandra outside. Emily stood still, her eyes following them, her heart heavy with helplessness. But she knew what she had done was right, even if it might come with consequences. As Sandra was led to the police car, she turned back to look at Emily. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. Emily nodded slightly, her eyes conveying that she wouldn't let this incident be forgotten. Outside the diner, what had just happened was far from over. These unjust actions would soon lead to consequences that Jake, Ryan, and Mike could never have anticipated. Inside Sunny Diner, the atmosphere remained tense even after Sandra was escorted out. Jake leaned against the counter, his expression cold, but inside, he couldn't hide his smugness. For him, everything was going according to plan. Sandra, the one he considered the problem at the diner, had finally been removed. He didn't realize that he had just sown the seeds of a much bigger storm. In a corner of the diner, a young man named Kevin Parker sat quietly, his eyes focused on his phone screen. Kevin, a journalism student, had unintentionally become a witness to the entire incident. As soon as he realized the situation was escalating beyond a small misunderstanding, he quickly pulled out his phone and started recording. From Jake's harsh words to Sandra's helplessness and Emily's bravery, it was all clearly captured. As Sandra was handcuffed and led outside, Kevin shook his head, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. How could a diner let this happen just because someone forgot their wallet, he thought. But instead of just sitting there frustrated, Kevin decided to take action. He quickly edited the video and added a headline that would grab attention: "Older woman humiliated at Sunny Diner just for forgetting her wallet. Do you think this is fair?" Kevin hit post and shared it on his social media accounts and groups he was part of. He had no idea that within minutes, the video would start gaining significant attention. In just 30 minutes, Kevin's video had hundreds of views and shares. Comments began pouring in, most expressing outrage at how Jake and the two officers treated Sandra. How could they handcuff an elderly woman just for forgetting her wallet? This is unacceptable. The police should be protecting citizens, not humiliating them like this. This diner needs to be held accountable. No one should be treated this way in public. Some people even began tagging their friends and family, sharing the story with a call to action. Boycott Sunny Diner. We can't let places like this exist. Meanwhile, Kevin received messages from strangers asking for more information about the incident. A few local journalists even reached out, asking for permission to use the video in their articles. Kevin quickly realized that this story was becoming much bigger than he had imagined. Inside Sunny Diner, Jake still hadn't realized how the video was spreading, but the mood in the diner began to shift. Young customers who had witnessed the event were no longer eating and chatting happily. They whispered among themselves, many scrolling through their phones. Some eyes, now full of judgment, began to turn toward Jake. Emily, still standing near the counter, noticed the change. She glanced at Jake, hoping he would recognize his mistake, but he remained indifferent. After a while, one of the young staff members rushed over to Jake, slightly panicked. "Jake, you should look at this," she said, handing him her phone. Jake took it, narrowing his eyes as he looked at the screen. Kevin's video was visible on the social media page, with hundreds of shares and comments. Jake's face turned pale as he read the comments, realizing that most people were criticizing how he had handled the situation. "What the hell is this?" Jake growled, but his voice was no longer as firm as before. He turned to the other staff, who were also holding phones, clearly having watched the video. "Who did this?" he asked, but no one responded. Emily crossed her arms and looked directly at Jake. "This is the consequence of not listening to the warnings, Jake. Sandra didn't deserve to be treated like that, and now everyone knows it." Jake didn't answer. He was starting to feel uneasy but still tried to maintain a calm exterior. "It's just a video. "It'll die down soon," he muttered, as if trying to reassure himself. Outside, Sandra was being led to the police car. Ryan and Mike, although accustomed to tense situations, were starting to feel uncomfortable. A group of people passing by had stopped, eyeing them with curiosity, even anger. A few whispered to each other, and Ryan caught words like injustice and humiliation. "Do you see anything wrong here?" Ryan quietly asked Mike as they seated Sandra in the back of the patrol car. Mike shrugged, but his eyes showed clear hesitation. "She's just an elderly woman. I don't think we needed to make such a big deal out of it, but now it's too late to turn back." Ryan looked down at his hands, confused. "Do you see how she's not like the others? It's like she's not afraid at all." Mike nodded slightly but said nothing more. Neither of them knew that at that very moment, the video was still spreading, and the consequences of their actions would soon catch up with them. While Jake was reeling from the wave of online criticism and Ryan and Mike were struggling with uneasy feelings, outside the diner, another sound cut through the air, drawing everyone's attention: the soft but powerful hum of a luxury car pulling up in front of Sunny Diner. The car door opened, and from inside stepped a tall man dressed in a sharp black suit. His face was stern, his eyes sharp, radiating both coldness and authority. Everyone in the diner and outside on the street immediately felt the shift in the atmosphere. The man was Captain James Whitmore, the head of the local police department. Ryan and Mike, standing outside by the patrol car with Sandra inside, instantly recognized the man who had arrived. Their faces turned pale, sweat starting to bead on their foreheads. They not only knew Captain Whitmore as their superior, but he was also infamous for being uncompromising when it came to misconduct within the police force. "Whitmore," Mike whispered, trying to hide the worry in his voice. Ryan lowered his voice, glancing at Mike. "Why is he here? We didn't report this to him directly." Mike shrugged, but his eyes never left Captain Whitmore, who was walking into the diner with an increasingly dark expression. Inside the diner, Jake also noticed the man in the suit who had just entered. At first, he thought he was just a wealthy customer. But when he saw Whitmore's piercing gaze scan the diner, Jake sensed that something was wrong. His intuition told him that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. Captain Whitmore walked through the door, his eyes immediately locking onto Jake. He didn't say a word, just stared, as if evaluating Jake in those few brief seconds. Then his gaze shifted to Emily, who was still standing near the counter. Emily, though a bit nervous, stood straight, as if Captain Whitmore's presence was the glimmer of hope for the justice she had been waiting for. "The elderly woman who was handcuffed, where is she?" Captain Whitmore asked, his deep voice carrying authority and cutting through the heavy silence. Jake stammered for a few seconds, trying to regain his composure. She didn't pay, and I called the police to handle it." Captain Whitmore raised an eyebrow, his gaze becoming even sharper. "Really? An elderly woman didn't pay, and you thought it necessary to handcuff her?" Jake swallowed hard, still trying to justify his actions. "I was just following the rules, sir. She didn't pay and wasn't cooperating. Which rule allows you to humiliate an elderly woman just for forgetting her wallet?" Whitmore interrupted, his tone as cold as ice. Jake stood frozen, unsure of what to say next. Whitmore didn't let Jake say another word. He turned and quickly walked outside, where Ryan and Mike were standing by the patrol car. When the two young officers saw Captain Whitmore approach, they straightened up, trying to appear calm, but their worried eyes betrayed their true feelings. "Ryan! Mike!" Whitmore called, his voice not loud but full of authority. "Who gave the order to handcuff the woman?" Ryan took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Captain, she didn't pay and wasn't cooperating, so we had to act to maintain order." Whitmore stared at them as if trying to look through their shells to find the truth. After a long moment of oppressive silence, he asked, "Did you investigate her circumstances before acting, or did you just listen to the manager and make your decision?" Mike opened his mouth to say something but stopped, his hesitation palpable. Ryan realized they had no valid excuse, and he lowered his head, unable to meet Captain Whitmore's piercing gaze. "And you thought handcuffing an elderly woman was the best way to handle this?" Whitmore continued, his voice growing colder. "Do you even know who she is?" Ryan and Mike exchanged confused glances. "No, sir," Ryan answered cautiously. Whitmore took a deep breath, his eyes still locked on the two officers. Then, he turned toward the patrol car, where Sandra sat silently, her demeanor calm but visibly carrying the weight of the humiliation she had endured. "She's my mother," Whitmore said, his voice steady but filled with restrained anger. Ryan and Mike froze in place, their faces drained of color. They were struck dumb by the revelation. Mike, who often carried an air of arrogance, could no longer mask his fear. Ryan, already uneasy, simply lowered his head further, sweat dripping from his temples. Without another word, Captain Whitmore walked up to the patrol car and gently opened the door. "Mom, are you all right?" he asked, his voice suddenly warm and full of concern. He reached down to remove the handcuffs from Sandra's wrists, his hands careful but firm. Sandra smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with pride and a touch of teasing humor. "I'm fine, James. But I think I'll reconsider visiting this diner again." Whitmore's jaw tightened, his frustration with the situation evident. He turned back to Ryan and Mike, his expression now icy. "You two stay right here. Don't move until I've sorted this out." His tone left no room for argument. The officers nodded, not daring to utter a word. Whitmore then turned toward Jake, who had been watching the entire scene from the diner's doorway. Jake's smug confidence had completely evaporated. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the counter for support. Whitmore strode back into the diner, his steps heavy with purpose. The room fell silent, every patron turning their attention to the imposing figure who now commanded the space. Jake's attempt to shrink behind the counter was futile, there was no escape from the wrath of Captain Whitmore. "You," Whitmore said, his voice sharp and unwavering, "step forward." Jake hesitated, his legs feeling like lead. Finally, he stepped out from behind the counter, his voice shaking as he tried to speak. "Sir, I..." Whitmore held up a hand, cutting him off. "Don't. Not a word until I ask for it." Jake swallowed hard, nodding mutely. Whitmore took a deep breath, then began, his tone measured but scathing. "You called the police on an elderly woman, on my mother, because she forgot her wallet. Did you even consider handling this with decency and respect? Or was your first instinct to publicly humiliate her?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, but the weight of Whitmore's glare silenced him. "This is more than just a lapse in judgment," Whitmore continued. "Your actions today reveal a complete lack of empathy and respect, not just for my mother but for all your customers. You've turned this diner, a place that was once welcoming to everyone, into a space of humiliation and hostility." Jake stammered, his voice barely audible. "Sir, I didn't know who she was. I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Whitmore interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Since when is it protocol to treat someone with such blatant disrespect over a minor mistake? Did you even bother to speak to her, to understand her circumstances?" Jake stood frozen, unable to answer. Whitmore turned toward Emily, who had been standing nearby, her expression a mix of nervousness and vindication. "Emily, is this how the diner has always handled situations like this?" "No, sir," Emily replied firmly. "Mrs. Sandra has been a loyal customer for years. She's always paid and never caused any trouble. Today was an exception, and she even offered to leave her belongings as a guarantee. This could have been resolved easily without involving the police." Whitmore nodded, his respect for Emily evident in his expression. He turned back to Jake. "You've not only humiliated a regular customer but also jeopardized the reputation of this diner. If you think this will go unnoticed, you're gravely mistaken." Jake tried once more to defend himself. "Captain, I..." "You're done here," Whitmore cut him off, his voice final. "I'll be reporting this incident to the diner's owner. Expect consequences." The room remained silent as Whitmore turned to Sandra. "Mom, let's get you out of here." Sandra stood gracefully, her dignity intact despite everything. She placed a gentle hand on Emily's arm. "Thank you, dear. Your kindness means more than you know." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. Take care, Mrs. Sandra. As Whitmore and Sandra exited the diner, the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Jake, Ryan, and Mike stood frozen, each grappling with the reality of their actions. But the storm brewing outside the diner would soon engulf them all. Sandra's visits to Harmony Cafe became a cherished part of her routine. Every week, she was greeted with smiles and warm hellos from the staff and other patrons. The cafe wasn't just a place for meals, it was a sanctuary of kindness and community, a stark contrast to the humiliation she had endured at Sunny Diner. The cafe's charm came not only from its cozy atmosphere but from the respect and care it showed to everyone who walked through its doors. One afternoon, while Sandra was enjoying her favorite roasted meat and coffee by the window, a young man approached her table. She recognized him immediately. It was Kevin Parker, the journalism student who had recorded the video that changed everything. "Mrs. Brown," Kevin began, a bit shy but with genuine warmth in his voice, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Kevin Parker. I was at Sunny Diner that day. I recorded the video of what happened to you." Sandra looked up at him, her eyes soft and understanding. "Kevin, thank you. What you did took courage, and it brought so much attention to something that could have been swept under the rug." Kevin nodded, his face earnest. "I didn't think it would gain so much attention. But when I saw how they treated you, I knew I had to do something. It wasn't right." Sandra gestured for him to sit, and the two began talking. Kevin shared how the video had gone viral and the overwhelming responses he had received from people around the world. He also spoke about his aspirations to become a journalist who could shed light on important issues and give a voice to those who often went unheard. Sandra listened intently, her face glowing with pride and gratitude. "Kevin, you're already doing what so many fail to do. You took a stand when it mattered, and because of you, people were held accountable. That's the kind of courage the world needs." Kevin left that afternoon feeling inspired, and Sandra felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were always people willing to do what was right. Meanwhile, Emily Green, the waitress who had stood up for Sandra, became a local hero. Her bravery was recognized not just by the community but also by a nearby restaurant group, which offered her a managerial position at one of their establishments. Though Emily had loved working at Sunny Diner for many years, she knew it was time to move on. On her last day at Sunny Diner, Emily left a note on the counter for Jake's replacement, who had been brought in to salvage what was left of the diner's reputation. The note read, "Respect and kindness are the foundation of any good business. Never forget that." Emily's new role brought her closer to her dreams, and she carried with her the lesson that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, always pays off in the end. For Ryan and Mike, their suspension gave them time to reflect deeply on their actions. They realized how their quick judgment and lack of empathy had not only hurt Sandra but also tarnished their standing as officers of the law. After weeks of soul-searching, they requested a meeting with Captain Whitmore. "We want to make amends," Ryan said, his voice steady but filled with remorse. "We know what we did was wrong, and we want to learn how to do better." Captain Whitmore, though firm in his expectations, saw sincerity in their eyes. He agreed to reinstate them under the condition that they participate in a rigorous community engagement program. Over the next several months, Ryan and Mike worked closely with local organizations, learning the value of patience, understanding, and treating every individual with dignity. One day, they visited Sandra's new favorite spot, Harmony Cafe, to deliver a personal apology. Sandra welcomed them with her usual warmth. "Apologies are important," she told them, "but learning from your mistakes is what truly matters. I hope you carry this lesson forward." The officers nodded, leaving the cafe with a sense of redemption and a renewed commitment to their roles. As the months passed, Sandra became a quiet symbol of resilience and dignity in her community. Her story continued to resonate with many, reminding them of the importance of standing up against injustice and treating every person with respect. Harmony Cafe, with its vibrant community and welcoming spirit, became a gathering place where people from all walks of life could connect, share stories, and feel valued. On a sunny afternoon, Captain Whitmore joined Sandra for one of their weekly lunches at the cafe. As they sat by the window, watching the world go by, Whitmore turned to his mother and smiled. You know, Mom, you've always taught me to stand up for what's right. That day at Sunny Diner, I realized how important it is to never forget that. Sandra reached across the table, placing her hand over his. And you've made me proud, James. It's not about the mistakes we make, it's about how we rise from them. The world needs more people who understand that. Their conversation was interrupted by Paul Gibson, the owner of Harmony Cafe, who approached their table with a small gift. Mrs. Sandra, he said, we wanted to show our appreciation for you. You've become such an important part of this cafe, and we're grateful to have you here. He handed Sandra a beautifully framed photo of the cafe with the words, "A place where kindness thrives." Sandra's eyes welled with tears as she accepted the gift. Thank you, Paul. This place has given me so much more than a meal, it's given me hope. As Sandra and her son left the cafe that afternoon, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Life, she realized, was full of challenges, but it was also full of second chances and the opportunity to build something better. Sandra's story, though born from an experience of injustice, became a beacon of hope and a reminder of the power of community, kindness, and standing up for what is right. As weeks turned into months, the echoes of the incident at Sunny Diner continued to ripple through the community. Sandra's story became more than just a cautionary tale, it became a symbol of resilience, kindness, and the importance of standing up for oneself and others. At Harmony Cafe, Sandra was greeted like family every time she arrived. The cafe staff, along with regular patrons, treated her with the utmost respect and care. She often found herself in conversations with young people who had heard her story and were inspired by her grace and courage. One day, as Sandra sat at her usual table by the window, a young woman approached her. Mrs. Sandra, the woman began, her voice a mix of admiration and nervousness. I just wanted to say that your story really moved me. It made me realize how important it is to treat everyone with respect, no matter their age or situation. Sandra smiled warmly. Thank you, dear. Life has a way of teaching us lessons, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. What's important is that we carry those lessons forward. The young woman nodded. It's changed how I see things. I've started volunteering at a local shelter, trying to make a difference in small ways. Your story was the push I needed. Sandra's heart swelled with pride. That's wonderful. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, makes the world a better place. Across town, Ryan and Mike were undergoing a transformation of their own. Their community engagement program had exposed them to the struggles and stories of people from all walks of life. They spent time volunteering at local food banks, mentoring at-risk youth, and participating in neighborhood discussions. Slowly but surely, they were earning back the trust of the community. One afternoon, while helping at a senior center, Ryan was approached by an elderly woman who had been watching him closely. Young man, she said, her voice kind but firm, I heard about what happened with Mrs. Sandra. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong and even more to work toward making it right. Ryan nodded, his expression earnest. I've learned a lot since then, ma'am. Mrs. Sandra taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Mike, who had overheard the conversation, chimed in. We let our assumptions cloud our judgment, and it hurt someone who deserved better. We're doing everything we can to make sure it never happens again. The elderly woman smiled, her eyes softening. That's all anyone can ask for. Keep doing the good work. Meanwhile, Emily Green thrived in her new managerial position at the family-owned restaurant. Her courage during the Sunny Diner incident had not only earned her the respect of the community but also inspired her co-workers to embrace a culture of kindness and fairness. Emily often shared her experience with her team, using it as a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right. At Harmony Cafe, Paul Gibson decided to organize a special event in Sandra's honor. The event, titled An Evening of Kindness, brought together community members to celebrate acts of empathy and humanity. The cafe was decorated with soft string lights and blooming flowers, creating an atmosphere of warmth and togetherness. When the evening arrived, Sandra was escorted to the cafe by Captain Whitmore, who had kept the event a surprise. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by a standing ovation from the crowd. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized the depth of the community's support and appreciation. During the event, several people shared stories of how Sandra's resilience had inspired them. Kevin Parker, the journalism student, spoke about how documenting Sandra's story had changed the course of his career. "Mrs. Sandra showed me the importance of using my voice to stand against injustice," he said. "Her dignity in the face of adversity is something I'll carry with me forever." Emily also took the stage, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Standing up for Mrs. Sandra was one of the most important decisions I've ever made. It reminded me that one person's courage can inspire an entire community." When it was Sandra's turn to speak, she stood at the center of the room, her presence radiating strength and warmth. "I never expected my small mistake that day to lead to all of this," she began. "But it has shown me that we are all connected, and how we treat one another matters deeply. Kindness is not just a gesture, it's a way of life." The room erupted in applause, and Sandra was overwhelmed by the love and respect she felt from everyone around her. The event was a testament to the fact that even in the face of hardship, the human spirit could shine brightly. In the days that followed, Sandra continued to live her life with grace and gratitude. Her weekly visits to Harmony Cafe became a tradition not just for herself but for the friends and neighbors who joined her. She often reflected on how far things had come since that fateful day at Sunny Diner. One afternoon, as Sandra sat by the window, sipping her coffee and watching the world go by, Captain Whitmore joined her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've become a bit of a celebrity, Mom," he teased, a warm smile on his face. Sandra chuckled softly. "I didn't ask for any of this, James. I just wanted to enjoy a quiet meal. But if my story can remind people to treat each other with kindness, then I'm grateful." Whitmore nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've taught me and so many others an important lesson. The world could use more people like you." Sandra reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "And it could use more people like you, James, people who stand up for what's right." As the sun set outside the cafe, Sandra felt at peace. She had faced humiliation, but she had emerged stronger, surrounded by a community that valued compassion and respect. Her story, though born from pain, had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that kindness could transform even the darkest moments into something beautiful. Sandra's story continued to ripple outward, becoming a symbol of hope and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was not just about her personal dignity, it became a narrative about the power of community, standing up against injustice, and how small acts of kindness could leave a profound impact. One morning, as Sandra prepared for her usual visit to Harmony Cafe, she received a letter in the mail. The envelope was simple, but the handwritten address intrigued her. Opening it carefully, she found a note from Ryan Davis and Mike Blake. The letter read, "Dear Mrs. Brown, ****. We are writing to express our deepest apologies for our actions that day at Sunny Diner. We failed you in every way possible, our judgment, our empathy, and our duty to serve the community with respect. We acted hastily, and in doing so, we caused you unnecessary pain and humiliation. For this, we are truly sorry. Your story has changed us. It has reminded us of what it means to uphold justice with integrity and humanity. We have been working hard to rebuild trust in the community and ensure that we never repeat the mistakes we made. If you would allow us, we would like the chance to meet with you in person to apologize directly and to hear any advice you might have for us as we move forward in our roles as officers. Thank you for showing grace and strength in the face of our failures. You've taught us lessons that we will carry with us for the rest of our lives. Sincerely, Ryan Davis and Mike Blake." Sandra set the letter down, her heart touched by their words. She had seen the regret in their eyes that day at Harmony Cafe, but this letter showed her they were committed to meaningful change. After taking a moment to reflect, she decided she would meet with them, not out of anger but to offer guidance and closure. A week later, Ryan and Mike arrived at Harmony Cafe, nervous but determined. They were greeted by Sandra, who waved them over to her table with a warm smile. The officers sat down, their faces etched with remorse. "Mrs. Brown," Ryan began, his voice steady but sincere, "thank you for agreeing to meet with us. We wanted to say how deeply sorry we are for everything that happened." Sandra nodded gently. "I appreciate you both taking the time to write to me and to meet in person. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong and even more to work toward making things right. Mike leaned forward, his tone earnest. We've been doing community work, volunteering, and attending training sessions. We're trying to rebuild trust and learn how to approach situations with more compassion. Sandra looked at them thoughtfully. That's a good start. But remember, it's not just about the actions you take now, it's about how you carry these lessons forward in every decision you make. People deserve respect, no matter their circumstances. Ryan and Mike nodded, visibly moved by her words. Thank you, Mrs. Brown, Ryan said. Your forgiveness means a lot to us. Sandra smiled softly. Forgiveness is a step toward healing, not just for me but for you too. Learn from this and make it count. Their conversation ended with a sense of resolution, and as the officers left, they felt a renewed determination to honor the lessons they had learned from Sandra's ordeal. Meanwhile, Emily Green's new restaurant was thriving. Her approach to managing her team, grounded in fairness and empathy, had created an atmosphere where both staff and customers felt valued. She often shared her story about standing up for Sandra with her employees, emphasizing the importance of courage and compassion in the face of adversity. Emily's success story inspired others in the restaurant industry to rethink how they treated their employees and patrons. She was invited to speak at community events, where she shared her belief that hospitality was about more than serving food, it was about creating spaces where everyone felt welcome. At Harmony Cafe, Paul Gibson decided to implement a new tradition inspired by Sandra's story. Every month, the cafe hosted a kindness brunch, inviting community members to share their experiences and nominate individuals who had gone above and beyond to help others. The event became a beloved gathering, fostering connections and strengthening bonds within the town. Sandra, of course, was a regular attendee. She often listened quietly as others shared their stories, occasionally offering words of encouragement or gratitude. Her presence at the brunches was a reminder of how one person's dignity and resilience could inspire a wave of positive change. One memorable afternoon, Sandra was approached by a young mother at the event. Mrs. Sandra, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, I just want to thank you. Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself at work when I was being treated unfairly. I wouldn't have had the strength without your example. Sandra reached out to hold the young woman's hand. I'm so glad you found your voice. Always remember, standing up for yourself is never wrong, and you deserve to be treated with respect. The young mother smiled, her eyes brimming with gratitude. As the months passed, Sandra's life remained rich with connection and purpose. She often reflected on how a single incident at Sunny Diner had led to a cascade of events that brought her closer to her community and reminded everyone of the importance of kindness and empathy. Sitting by the window at Harmony Cafe one sunny morning, sipping her coffee, Sandra looked out at the bustling street. Her heart swelled with gratitude for the people who had stood by her, the lessons she had learned, and the new beginnings she had found. Life, she knew, was full of challenges, but with courage and compassion, it could always lead to something beautiful.